I think a love of classical composition and rock and roll and everything classical rock and roll, some bluegrass, some swing.
Picture this: a guitarist who once stood silently at the back of the stage, his long blonde hair falling like a curtain as he powered Deep Purple's sound for decades, suddenly steps forward and pulls the veil off the band's darkest corners. Steve Morse, the virtuoso who joined the legendary rock group in 1994, has finally broken his silence. What fans once believed was brotherhood has today been shattered. Morse reveals a battlefield of jealousy and resentment, truths so raw they crack the myth in an instant. Back in 1994, Steve Morse entered Deep Purple like a fresh wind after the fiery and unstable Ritchie Blackmore stormed out for the last time. Fans celebrated, critics cheered, and the band seemed to gain a new sense of energy, as if a long-suffering storm had finally cleared. Yet behind those smiles and standing ovations, another storm brewed silently. From the very first rehearsals, Morse felt the heavy shadow of Blackmore looming over him, an invisible rival haunting every riff he played. No matter how skilled, no matter how inventive, he was forever marked as the outsider, the hired gun who could never carry the weight of being an original. Every applause from the crowd felt like it carried an echo of comparison, warm on the surface, but cold underneath. Every backstage conversation carried whispers of rivalry, subtle reminders that he was both welcomed and unwelcome at the same time. It was the cruel contrast of glory and rejection, triumph on stage and alienation in the dressing room that defined his earliest days with Deep Purple. Think of it, a band that had already lived through explosive breakups, drug-fueled feuds, and bitter departures was supposed to be reborn with Morse at the helm of the guitar. But instead of renewal, old wounds festered like scars that refused to close. Ian Gillan still carried the bitterness of his long war wit. With Blackmore, every note sung with traces of past anger. Ian, Pace, and Roger Glover, loyal guardians of the band's legacy, yet exhausted from endless turmoil, often found themselves trapped in the middle, torn between honoring nostalgia and reaching for something new. For Morse, it was like walking into a grand mansion haunted by ghosts. He had to fight not just for space on stage, but for a place in their story, a story already written in pain, ego, and betrayal. The weight of history pressed on his shoulders, reminding him with every rehearsal and every tour that he was entering a battlefield disguised as a band. The ghosts of the past did not let him breathe, suffocating even the brightest sparks of creativity with memories of bloodied rivalries and fractured brotherhoods. The longer he stayed, the clearer it became. Deep Purple was not a united family, but a collection of rivalries stitched together by money, fame, and necessity. Each man pulled the band in a different direction. Gillan thirsted for freshness and reinvention, while Glover clung to the comfort of tradition.
Talk about a complex. You come from a small town like I did, and all right, hey, here's the new guys in the class.
Pace longed for calm stability, but Morse pushed boldly for modern touches that unsettled the others. Rehearsals often began with laughter and camaraderie, but spiraled into shouting matches, the sound of raised voices echoing louder than their amplifiers. Tours were not journeys of joy, but battlefields of egos, with grudges riding along from city to city. Even something as simple as choosing a set list became a spark that ignited raging fires. Classics versus new, songs, nostalgia versus evolution. Fans only saw the polished shows, the roaring solos, and the smiling bows. Yet behind the curtain, the arguments were brutal, sharp as broken glass. Morse found himself caught in the crossfire, his loyalty questioned and his vision dismissed, always reminded that he was not part of the old guard, and that every step forward meant stepping into another hidden minefield of resentment. By the early 2000s, the cracks began to show. On stage, the chemistry was flawless, a spectacle of sound that fooled audiences into thinking harmony reigned. But away from the lights, there was silence at dinner tables, cold shoulders in dressing rooms, and a constant undercurrent of resentment that grew heavier with every tour. Decisions about records dragged endlessly because each member pulled in a different direction, often refusing to compromise. Recording sessions stretched on with unfinished takes, aborted mixes, and bitter arguments over who should control the final sound. Morse, a perfectionist with a deep love for crafting music, often found himself dismissed. His fresh ideas waved away in favor of what the veterans clung to. He would bring riffs, entire song sketches, even daring arrangements to the table, only to watch them die in the shadow of nostalgia. Meetings meant to spark creativity often ended with slammed doors and words left hanging like smoke in the air. The very band that once prided itself on reinvention was now suffocating under its own stubbornness, chained to its past glories and too fractured to carve a bold new path. Behind the music, there were struggles too personal for the fans to ever see. Health, problems, addictions, and family tragedies weighed heavily on the band, creeping into every note they played. Morse watched as bandmates hid their pain behind the curtain of rock stardom, masking private anguish with loud riffs and forced smiles. Those scars bled into their work, making rehearsals tense and recording sessions unpredictable. There were nights when tempers exploded without warning, fueled not just by artistic disagreements, but by deep personal frustrations, arguments that began over a chord. Change could suddenly spiral into bitter accusations about loyalty, money, or the past. Some carried the weight of broken marriages, others struggled with drinking too much on the road, and still others battled the exhaustion of endless touring that stripped them of rest and family time. Morse, who had stepped in with the hope of being a bridge, instead found himself drowning in the storm. He became both participant and witness, a silent keeper of secrets he never asked to hold. Each unspoken struggle turned into another stone on his shoulders, dragging him down even as the audience cheered louder than ever. On stage, the crowd roared, the riffs soared, and Deep Purple seemed eternal. Spotlights bathed them in glory, and to the audience they looked like brothers bonded by decades of music. But once the lights dimmed, Morse often walked away from the dressing room with a heavy heart. The unity fans believed in was only an illusion, a mask worn for survival. Band members traveled separately, sometimes booking different hotels, avoiding each other whenever possible. Offstage, silence replaced laughter, and years of bitterness followed them like shadows. Old grudges resurfaced during the small E. Disagreements, whether over set lists, royalties, or creative control, and the tension was thick enough to silence an entire room. Picture the scene backstage. Gillan sitting alone, headphones on, ignoring the world. Glover, lost in paperwork, focused more on management than music. Pace, tired of refereeing battles, and Morse quietly slipping out, burdened by conflicts that were never his, but that still crushed him. The image of the unbreakable rock band was carefully crafted for the outside world, while behind the curtain, the wars never ended, and the smiles were painted masks, hiding years of wounds. What Morse now reveals is not just a collection of small disagreements, but the truth that Deep Purple's legendary status came at a cost. Fame preserved the band, but it also poisoned them. Instead of celebrating new music, they clung to old hits, returning night after night to the same classics that once defined them but now chained them. The set lists became monuments to the past rather than bridges to the future. Think of the irony. A band known for breaking barriers and reinventing rock was now suffocating under its own legend. Behind the curtain, members resented the repetition, but feared the backlash of changing direction. Creative discussions often turned into dead ends, with Morse's modern ideas dismissed as risky or unworthy of the Purple brand. Even success left a bitter taste. Each sold-out tour only deepened the cracks, for the music that brought riches also imprisoned them in nostalgia. Instead of embracing each other as brothers in art, they tolerated one another for survival, dragging their name through decades of unspoken grudges and compromises. What could have been a rebirth with Morse slowly turned into a descent into stagnation, fueled by unresolved rivalries, whispered betrayals, and the suffocating weight of their own myth. And now, at last, the silence is broken. Steve Morse exposes the fractures, the conflicts, the disappointments, and the scandals that lived behind the glittering mask of Deep Purple. For fans, it is a shock to realize that the band they worship was built not on harmony, but on tension. For Morse, it is a release, a chance to tell the world what truly happened behind the purple curtain. He describes years of bottled frustrations, rehearsals where voices were raised louder than the amplifiers, and tours where the smiles for cameras dissolved into long, wordless silences on the bus. He brings up the heavy burden of living under the myth of Deep Purple, where every note had to fight against the weight of expectations and every decision seemed chained to the past. The legacy of the band had become both a crown and a curse. Picture this. After decades of sold-out arenas and roaring encores, Morse and his bandmates often left the stage walking in separate directions, refusing even to share the same corridor. The glory of their name hid bruises of betrayal, power struggles over money, and songwriting credits and grudges that refused to die. It was a house built on shaky foundations, where even friendship was sacrificed for the survival of the brand. The legacy of Deep Purple will always shine in rock history, but Morse's revelations remind us that even legends are human. Sometimes the chords we hear as triumph were struck in bitterness, and the thunder of applause drowned out the sound of breaking trust. Behind the music, there was loneliness, disappointment, and the bitter taste of victories that felt hollow. And now the fans, at last, are allowed to see the whole story. Not the myth, but the fragile truth hidden in the shadows of the purple curtain.